Got it.
Woo woo, emergency question hospital. Question number 1. Okay. Hello, my name is James Bach. I have with me here Michael Bolton, and we are going to do session number 1 of question hospital. What is question hospital? People send us questions. We've now gathered a bunch of questions. Then I assess the health of that question. What I mean by that is that not all questions should be answered. Not all questions should be answered straight. Some questions should be reworded, reconceived before they are answered, because part of the problem, and maybe even part of the origin of the question, is that the person asking the question doesn't really understand what they're asking about. So we've got to fix the ontology, fix the semantics of the question first. So
in other words, framing the question properly helps to get an answer to the problem the person is trying to solve. But if the question isn't framed in a way that will lend itself to a solution, then trouble will ensue.
Right. So we assess the health, change the question into a better question that reflects the intent of the questioner to the best of our ability to discern that, and then we answer the new question. That's how it works. So
now
let's try it out.
Better, to be clear, better being making it easier for us to answer on our terms. And sometimes that might work for the questioner, and sometimes it might not.
Yeah. Well, I don't care. I'm going to answer every question from the point of view of my own understanding of testing and my own test methodology, which I am promoting. So if somebody is asked a question about someone else's methodology, we will translate that into our own terms before we answer it.
Or just duck the question entirely.
Here comes the first one.
All right.
Are you ready, Michael?
I am ready.
From rapid software testing perspective, firstly, should test cases be written? If so, then should it be a free-flowing format to jot down imp test points, or should they follow a specific format? If test cases should not be written, then why, and what else should be done that would be more beneficial? Now, the first thing we always do is grammatical stabilization, or I sometimes call it stabilization, or I may call it normalization in the future. I just want to reword the question into standard American business English without changing anything else about it, so that I'm clear on what we're trying to answer. So when I did that,
I find it's worthwhile to do that because I have it's a kind of reverse dyslexia almost. I really stumble when I see stuff that's incorrectly spelled, or it's an immense distraction to me.
Well, in this case, the question didn't require very much manipulation. In some cases, we really have to scratch our heads and figure out, what is this guy talking about? But in this case, Abhijeet's question did not require us to do very much. So from the perspective of rapid software testing, should test cases be written? The most of the rest of it we didn't have to change at all. Now the next stage, Michael, is semantic and ontological diagnosis. We have to look at the question and say, is there anything that is wrong with the question ontologically or semantically? By semantically, we mean with regard to what the words mean in it.
Interpretation.
And ontologically, that means with regard to what is being discussed, the objects of discourse. So in this case, I would say, here's my answer. Now, you haven't seen this, Michael, so I need your reaction. I think that the condition of the question is fair, could be better. I think there are some important problems, though. Ambiguity, for instance, about what kind of answer that Abhijeet is looking for. I mean, is Abhijeet asking about what he should do on his project here and now? Or is he asking about the general policy of rapid software testing? Those are two different things. Not entirely clear to me which one he's after. He hasn't given us much context to go on. He's using words, two words in particular, two terms in particular: test case, that is ambiguous, and written, which is an ambiguous idea. Sometimes when people say they wrote something, like writing a test case, all they mean is created a test case, thought up a test case. And sometimes they literally mean write down in a textual form.
Yeah, comedians work like that. They write jokes, but a lot of the time they don't commit them to a notebook. Some do, some don't. There's another thing I keyed on, though, which was should, which might appeal to your to your point one. But if you scroll back up to the question.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes. The word should.
Yes. By
Yes.
whom? According to who? I guess from the perspective of rapid software testing, but should they be written? Who should they be written by?
Okay, that's a good point. I should add that as a bullet item. I should have added that as a bullet item. There is
the first two, though.
There is I actually have included this in my treatment. I didn't have it in my diagnosis. So my treatment plan has, as you notice, 5 bullet points. And it has 5 because I have actually dealt with the other one. The should, to me, represents a best practice framing.
Right.
And whenever we see should, my father used to tell me that whenever someone uses the word should, what they're really saying is what my father would want me to do. And he being my father, and it was particularly relevant. Whenever you say should, just imagine the person said, well, my father thinks that I must do this. And you can substitute father for any kind of authority. So who's the authority? Where does should come from? Now, if you don't give us any context of what the problem is, it's very hard for us to say, well, this would solve your problem in our expert opinion, or because of these reasons. In rapid software testing, we don't promote best practices. We promote understanding problems and heuristics that help you solve those problems. And then we promote taking responsibility for making those decisions.
Understanding problems and the context in which those problems are perceived as well. I think that's an important.
But that's all part of a problem. Yeah. I mean, you can say we can separate context from the problem itself, or we can say it's all context, or we can say it's all problem. That I meant to include all that in, but it's fair to say that. So in order to fix this, we've got to reject the best practice framing. We have to replace that with a context-driven framing. We need to, or else we won't be practicing our own test methodology of rapid software testing, which is a liberational kind of methodology. It's a methodology that allows me, you, anyone to do what they think is right. And in fact, it says you must do what you think is right. We need to normalize definitions of test case and right in order to answer the question. And I think we should review some different relevant project context. Since he didn't give us a context, we can sample the space of interesting context and say, in this context, we might do this. In that context, we might do that. With that in mind, I have treated this question, and this is what results. This is my new rewritten question, which is now rewritten as basically 4, 5, 6 questions. It's been separated out. So let's take them one at a time. Maybe he's asking, what is the general attitude of rapid software testing methodology toward the practice of documenting narrative test procedures? So we've got, instead, notice that I didn't say test case. Notice that I'm guessing what Abhijeet means by test case.
In other words, a certain kind of test case that involves a step-by-step procedure, and not necessarily the kind of test case where somebody says, well, make sure it comes out with the correct calculation based on this list of outputs given that list of inputs.
So by test procedure, well, by procedure, I mean a specific way of doing something. By test procedure, I mean a specific way of performing a test. By narrative test procedure, I mean a kind of procedure which proceeds step by step, where each step flows into the next. Because you could have a documented procedure which is not narratively documented. It is in a tabular form, and it lays out some variables, and then you have a model in your head that turns that into a specific thing to do. So by narrative test procedure, I'm talking about the classic step 1, do this, step 2, do that, step 3, then do this.
Because a checklist, for example, would afford you the mandate to do these things, but you don't have to do them in any particular order.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's fine.
And we're talking about documented, meaning rendered in the form of written text is what I mean. As opposed to figuring out the test procedure, telling it to someone else, having it be part of training, having it be an oral tradition. I'm talking about turning that into a written artifact of some kind.
So explicit rather than tacit.
Explicit rather than tacit. Absolutely. So what is the general? I think this is what he was asking. The point is, I might be wrong because I might misunderstand this question, but I believe he's asking about what the general attitude is about of rapid software testing methodology toward the practice of documenting narrative test procedures and using them to control the test process, to drive the test process. So, Michael, what is your answer to that question?
Could you repeat the question? I was observing. I was, to be honest,
it's right there in writing. Here it is in writing.
Oh, the first one. The first.
Yes, that question is the question we want to answer.
Okay.
Try answering it.
Because you say the question is cured. I see the question as having had babies. It has reproduced. All right. What is the general attitude of rapid software testing towards the practice of documenting narrative test procedures and using them to drive the test?
Well, hold on. You just accused me of something. I don't want to let that go.
Well, all right.
I cured the question. What that means is I've turned the question into something that I can answer more or less directly without having to explain all the details of what I mean by the words that I'm using. That's what I mean by curing the question. I mean, I can take a question like this and just go right into answering it without complaining about the ontology of the question or the terms that are used and that sort of thing. I might, if someone came to me with this, I might confirm my understanding of documenting narrative test procedure, confirm that I understand it in the same way that they do. So that's something you kind of always have to do, because you never know if your words and their words actually match up. This is why I say that there's not a single word of the ISTQB syllabus that I agree with. Because even when they use the word test, they're not talking about the same thing I talk about when I say the word test. And when they say structured, they don't mean the same thing that I mean when I say structured. I mean, we don't even agree on very basic ideas. So they might say something that I would say. Well, when I say it, I mean a certain thing by it. When they say it, it doesn't mean that thing. So part of the curing process means that I have worked it up into a mental model that makes sense to me. And I'm trying to express that in words that if I said them to you, you may not feel like you need to redo the question. But maybe you do feel like you have to redo the question.
It actually kind of reminds me, or it puts in mind an image of what it means to be healthy. Because in some cultures, to be healthy means to be, full and stocky. In other cultures, to be healthy means being quite trim and skinny and so on. Anyway, I will now try to answer that question. I will say that our general attitude toward the practice of documenting narrative test procedures and using them to drive the process is one of skepticism. I do not reject the possibility that a documented narrative test procedure could be helpful. But what I would like to do is I would like to open people's minds to other forms of things that can drive is not necessarily a word I'd pick, but inform or guide perhaps. Because drive has, just like you were saying, drive has a couple of different meanings. One is to drive, to pound something in, but the other is to, like the French word conduire, to conduct the test process. So it might be okay, but it does seem to be very often documented narrative test procedures are expensive, and very often they're done prematurely, and very often they're done in a way that is over-focused. So our general attitude towards them, I would say, is that we must be very cautious about them to make sure that they're not overly formalized and or premature. That'd be my first run at an answer to that.
I concur with your answer and feel I have nothing important to add to it. So
splendid.
My judgment in choosing you to answer that question was quite splendid. I'm really good at this. Okay, anyway, next question. In general, now you can criticize these questions because I think I've cured them, but you might say that you might see that I've done the stitching wrong. Right. In general, does RST recommend that we use a specific format when we document test procedures? Or does RST have no opinion on the format as long as important test points are covered? So notice I've preserved the language of Abhijeet's original question as much as I could, but he said important test points. I think he said that, and I'm preserving that because I think that's not particularly problematic a way to talk. Okay, what do you think about that one?
The first question, does RST recommend we use a specific format when we document test procedures? I think I can provide a fairly straightforward no to that. I don't think we do.
I agree, no.
Or does RST have no opinion on the format as long as important test points are covered?
Well, we do have a bit of an opinion on the format.
Yes, I would say that we have a bias.
Toward?
Our bias is towards the fastest, least expensive, most informative testing that we can do that completely fulfills the testing mission.
So we're going for the leanest way that we can document.
That's our bias is to do that. Now,
is there a particular format you tend to use?
When we document test procedures, one is not exactly a format, but it's a situation in time. post hoc, after the fact, I'd like to document.
So that's not a format though.
No, right, exactly. That's why I made that qualification. It's I prefer to have a very open and concise and to some degree minimal guidance for procedures. I prefer to discover those as I go, and there are exceptions. My preference will be overridden when something must be observed in a specific way or must be done to check specific facts.
What about gherkin?
The
gherkin format, the given, when, then kind of format.
Well, I don't think of that as a test procedure at all. I think of that as a description of how a procedure, which is not a test procedure, should happen, or somebody.
Well, someone could write a test procedure with that format, could they not?
Yeah, I think it would be pretty arid. A lot of the time when I see examples of that, they're pretty limited. They don't, put it this way, they don't cover important test points. They cover explicit, specific observations that seem to happen in very narrow conditions. They don't point out the fact that there's lots of different things that are going on in the software. There might be lots of things that are different things that are going on in the user's intentions and behaviors, put together, the user's actions. So I bridle at gherkin. It might be useful as a point of departure, but it certainly would not, for me, help to make sure that important test points are covered.
I wouldn't use gherkin. I think it is dangerously limited, and its limitations are actually celebrated as some sort of advantage by the people who use it. And
well,
I think
encoded, right?
I think it's the exact opposite of an advantage. I think it's a terrible thing. That's like celebrating trains because they can't steer and going, that's so wonderful that trains can't steer. But if your goal is to explore everywhere in an area, using a train to do that is probably a very bad idea.
Well, I agree, but there are cases, of course, in which a train not steering is a wonderful thing. So
just not in the context of trying to explore the details of a small area where you don't know where you may need to go next. The train is for an efficient way of moving from one place to another, moving a lot of mass from one place to another to fixed points. That's what a train is efficient at.
So what I would reply is, I want to say what you just said about I wouldn't use gherkin, but context-driven principles inhibit me from saying that. What I really want to say is I don't like gherkin, but there may be some sort of circumstance as a heuristic.
So can't we be context driven and talk about problems?
Absolutely.
So I have a problem with the overstructuring of communication. And so I can say, I'm concerned about the overstructuring of communication that comes from gherkin. That's not saying never use gherkin. That's saying it has this problem. And if you can overcome the problem and obtain some advantage, that's fine with me. But
we may have to check the game films, but I thought you said I wouldn't use gherkin.
I wouldn't use gherkin. Well, we may have to check the game films, but the game films on that, I suppose. But if I said I wouldn't use gherkin, I mean I wouldn't use it for any context that I can foresee.
Right, and I would also say that because gherkin once again, seems to me a way of expressing a requirement. I wonder about its relevance to testing at all, except as any other way of stating a requirement, something that we might want to examine or explore or challenge or contest relative to the product. So I might use it in that way. For instance, if somebody comes to me with here's my given when thens for all this thing, as a tester, that would set fire to me. I'd say, okay, so given what exactly, and what other conditions? What else is going on in this situation? On what platform is this thing running? Have you considered timing in this? And what other things have to be in place for this thing to happen? So I would treat it not as I wouldn't treat it as a test procedure. I would treat it as a requirement specification.
Okay, well, getting back to test procedures, do we have no opinion on the format? I would say we have a bias towards plain text, mind maps, and tables.
In documentation, yes. And we also have a bias towards an assumption that the reader,
I like diagrams too.
Oh, absolutely. The reader and the user of these artifacts requires sufficient tacit knowledge to interpret them appropriately.
Right, which is kind of an unformat. I mean, I think when we speak of any sort of documentation, we're speaking about a message provided to someone in the future or in another place, and it might be yourself in the future or in another place.
Right.
That always happens within a certain context, and one and very important kind of context is that person's tacit knowledge. So if you are trying to communicate to someone who has no knowledge, well, then you're going to have to do a lot of heavyweight documentation. But that's the excuse that a lot of people use to do heavyweight documentation. But there's a much better solution, which is don't ever do that. Don't ever be trying to communicate complex things to people who are completely unprepared for it. In fact, corporate America, corporate world, the corporate world in general, already knows this, because look at the job descriptions. Do any job descriptions say wanted, comptroller for major Fortune 500 company? Must have experience. Must have experience reading instructions carefully and following them. That's it. That's all you need. Do you need an experience as a comptroller? Well, no, because all the procedures are written down. There's books and books about how to do it. So do you have experience reading books? Good, because you're going to need to read all about being a comptroller, presumably, since up to now, you've only been a party planner. But you're hired because we gave you a little instructions sheet about how to get to the interview, and you were really good. You got to the interview on time.
America, land of opportunity.
There you go. So nobody hires that way. Everyone says you need training, you need to do relevant degree, relevant education. So why do we just think that only when it comes to testing, we have to assume that testers are stupid, that know nothing about the product, that there's no other way of communicating other than writing things down? There's no video, there's no training, there's no people talking to each other, and there's no learning, there's no memory.
Yeah. Okay.
It's crazy.
I think we're covered.
All right.
We've done a reasonable
Next
job.
question. If RST recommends against test procedures being documented, then why? And what else should be done that would be more beneficial? I'll take this one, and then you can. How about that? We do, in general, recommend against premature documentation of test procedures. And in general, we recommend minimizing documentation because documentation is expensive. Because once you've documented something, that has now become a citizen of your world. It now has civil rights. You now have to update the document. as I like to say, the fun part about having kids is right at the very beginning, right at the earliest moment of procreation is the fun part. After that, it's a lot of work. And you can't just send your little children into the street saying, oh, I brought you good into the world, good luck. You have to clothe them, you have to feed them, you have to take care of them when they're sick, you have to see to their education. I'm a parent. It goes on and on and on. Similarly, people speak very glibly about documenting things without realizing what a maintenance nightmare that's going to be potentially for you, because that document goes out of date. It gets obsolete, but you don't have time to keep it up to date. So that part is just ignored by so many companies, leading to disastrous waste. And I keep seeing people with test cases that they don't follow anymore. They're told to follow them. Oh, but they're all out of date, or they're half out of date. How do they know they're out of date? Because they have tacit knowledge that tells them what's really going on, and the documents are no longer helping them. What else should be done that's more beneficial? Learn how to take test notes while you are testing. Learn how to use mind maps to, in a lean way, to collect your ideas. That would be more beneficial. Use video to explain things to people. Use paired testing to help people understand. So I was in a testing swarm event just today where a whole bunch of people tested something. And while we were testing, we were talking to each other over an open line on a Zoom call and saying, I just saw this, what's this? And is that supposed to happen? And then the experts, a few experts were online who would answer our questions. And when people saw something weird, they'd take a screenshot, drop it into the Slack chat, or in this case, Microsoft Teams. We'd drop the screenshot in, and the experts would look at the screenshot and say, well, that's actually not a bug because of this and this and this, or that is a bug, but we already know it. This was not just a testing event. This was a co-learning event. Was anyone in this situation following documented test cases? As far as I know, nobody was. So I think that's more beneficial.
So let's see. I concur with the added note that in the moment of procreation for a test procedure document, not even that part is any fun. That's one thing. The other is that the test procedure document, it seems to me, puts a sense of rigidity on the procedure, such that, for example, the kid is always paralyzed walking across the street, because the kid learns early on, you're not supposed to walk across the street without holding your parent's hand. Well, the document at that point, the kids grow, but documents don't. They stay static, they're time bound. And as you point out, there's a maintenance burden on them, or they start becoming irrelevant and you start ignoring them. You mentioned a couple of means of documenting testing work. Concise expression, 1 or 2 sentences to describe a charter for a mission of testing, or the more explicit and formalized and thorough stuff that shows up in the rapid software testing appendices, the scenario test protocol, the PCE testing protocol. That's wonderful stuff. And I would recommend, when you edit this video, you pop it up on the screen, or pop up a link to my Breaking the Test Case Addiction blog. Both of those, documents, because they're documents, contain examples of that particular document, instances of that document. When you mention mind maps, one of the things that you didn't mention that I would like to call out is that mind maps are remarkably legible in my experience, even to people who don't do testing, among other things, when they're large and elaborate and expansive and they cover a whole lot of conditions and a whole lot of the test space. What that helps to do is it helps our clients to see how much work is in front of us and how many different perspectives there might be on it. Because in a typical product coverage outline, for example, I don't think you mentioned that either. Product coverage outline? Don't think you mentioned it. So that
No,
would
I
be
have not mentioned that because we're
something
talking
worth
about
mentioning.
narrative test procedures.
Oh, strictly speaking, it's not a procedure, but it frames what people might be examining as they enact the procedure. And
Well, yeah, actually, it does apply to this because the question is, if we recommend against, then what would be more beneficial? Well, what would be more beneficial is don't document the procedural aspects of it, document the elements, the coverage elements, which does lead to a product coverage outline concept, which we generally do in mind map form.
so it occurs to me this question has two forks. One is, if RST recommends against test procedures being documented, one way of answering that question is to consider, well, what would you document instead? But another is, if rapid software recommends against test procedures being documented, then what else could be done that might be more beneficial? Well, one answer to that would be don't document them. Don't document test procedures. So you could pay attention to the what else could be documented or how else could test procedures be expressed or institutionalized. How about putting it that way? How could they be?
And there's different
built into
ways
the
to do it. You can have a recording system. You could
Right.
use video to record the testing that you did. You could be a good note taker, taking notes on what you actually do. You
Log
can use
files.
log files, all that kind of thing. The final
So
question,
okay.
final question, at 37 minutes into this.
This 10-minute lump.
Yeah. So dealing with the should issue, I changed it to how does RST guide me to decide for my own project whether I should? So this puts should in context. This is locating it as me deciding for myself what's a good way to proceed in this situation here and now. So what do I think I should do as opposed to what does some expert think I should do?
Which is paradoxical. It's a real paradox of both RST and context-driven thinking, in that RST supposedly is an approach for doing testing, but a set of approaches for doing testing, but, and we're the authors of it. You're the author, I'm the co-author. One of the first things that RST does is to emphasize that it's your call, it's your choice, your sets of decisions as the tester in context and collaboration with your clients and your developers and your managers and so on. So one of the things is that RST does not dictate, but it guides you how to make the decision, not how to do it, but how to decide what to do. I think that's an important first premise of the answer that we're about to give.
That's the context-driven idea. The context-driven idea puts the practitioner in the responsible role. And we actually have a term for that. We call that person the responsible tester. The responsible tester is analogous to what in the flying world is called the pilot in command. The pilot in command is the person officially flying the aircraft who is making the decisions about what to do and when. There's always one of those people, and that is called the pilot in command.
Which is distinct from the captain versus the first officer, which is how they're usually designated on the plane. first officer is not the, may be the pilot in command flying the plane, even though the captain isn't, and the captain is
Right. The
nominally.
pilot in command is currently the person who is flying the plane, and they're very explicit about who at the moment is the pilot in command.
I guess one's about authority and the other's about control of the airplane at that moment.
Be that as it may, we're talking about responsibility. So how can I responsibly decide for myself that I should document this way instead of that way? How does RST help me decide this? Well, I have put together a few contexts about that. So these might be interesting. These are some contexts that occurred to me. So RST encourages us to think about various kinds of contexts, such as the beginning, the end, regulated versus unregulated, test cases that might be in the context of an automated process, test cases, and again, we're talking about narrative test procedures in this particular situation, intended for someone else other than the author to follow, that are intended to be used by somebody else. And then that a special case of that is something intended for a junior tester or someone who's not a tester at all, a business analyst who might be following this. Depending on the context or combination of contexts.
And that's just a sample, isn't it?
You may, these are some pretty, prominent ones, but there could be other kinds of contexts. So in rapid testing, we are encouraged to understand the variables that could affect things. So for instance, if you are near the beginning of a project, you have some time. So near the beginning of the project, maybe postpone documentation until you know more about what's going on. Toward the end of the project, you're running out of time. Your time is probably best spent doing something else other than documenting, but there might be certain procedures that you do wish to preserve that you have developed, and you may worry that they have particular specific elements that are easy to forget. And you need these not to be forgotten, or else this really good test will be forgotten forever. I frequently do this with tools that I create. I'll create a tool, I'll walk away from it. 6 months later, I have to figure out, what is this tool? Why did I call it this? What did I do with it? So I've adopted a discipline of writing in a little README file for any tools I write, even for myself, so that when I come back, I have a little cheat sheet that gets me up to speed again. Now, if you're in a regulated project, there are laws or regulations which specifically lay out certain things that need to be documented, perhaps documented in certain specific formats, depending on whether you are following certain standards or not. So you need to know what standards you are following. Often in regulated projects, people uncritically accept, oh, I must document everything narratively and in great detail. That is not necessarily the case. The laws don't necessarily tell you that. So sometimes you have to push back and look at what those regulations actually say. But in general, a regulated project requires that you do some sort of documentation of your test process, or else you may be prevented from selling or marketing your product. Procedures that are meant to be automated are different than procedures that are meant to be followed by humans. You have to be more explicit. You have to understand the limitations of the automation process. Procedures that are intended for someone other than yourself may require that you identify more context, use language that is universally understood, and avoid acronyms and other things that the other people might not be familiar with. And of course, if you're going to guide stuff for a junior tester, I would say this is a really dangerous area. I would say don't give junior testers procedures at all, because you can't trust junior testers to follow procedures. You can't trust them. Following procedures is hard. It requires discipline. It requires motivation. I don't believe, unless I really know a junior tester well, I don't just automatically believe that I can hand a procedure and have them understand it and follow it correctly without being personally supervised by someone who is senior. So I would say if you're trying to do documentation for a junior tester, what you want to do is very open-ended documentation. You want to give them challenges. You want to say, test in this area, and then tell me what you find. You want to make it more of something where they're going to be exploring, using their minds, and experiencing the fun of testing. And if you really have a procedure that has to be followed very specifically, you should probably be giving that to a more senior tester who is aware of the seriousness of following procedures and has the discipline to do that.
Or you might want to encode it, right? You might want to, if it is something that needs to be checked specifically, you might want to document it in the form of code rather than the form of a narrative procedure.
It could be if
So-
something really needs to be very specific. A lot of tests don't need to be very specific. They are written down specifically, but a lot of the details could change and it would be just as good a test. So I want that when I'm documenting tests, I want to document the minimum necessary to get the value that I need. And I don't want to over document, because that's going to be harder to maintain, harder to follow. It will tend to turn the tester's mind off, and I need to keep the tester's mind turned on. This is a fundamental principle in rapid software testing. Keep the tester's mind turned on. We treat the tester's mind as a delicate instrument that's easily flummoxed, easily biased. You've got to learn how not to ruin the effectiveness of a tester's mind. A junior tester is more subject to disturbing, hostile influences than a senior tester. I mean, you give me scripts and I am highly likely to just say, I'm not following this, or I'm going to change it. I don't think these are good tests. But, you know, I have many years in the field and I have a lot of assertiveness, and I have no problem pushing back. I don't ask myself, do I really know what I'm doing? I know that I know what I'm doing. So I am going to be assertive. I'm going to be pushy about my testing. I'm going to take responsibility for it. I will take control of it, and I'm not going to let anyone else control it if I have the responsibility for it. But junior testers, you can't say the same thing.
True. So that was the open versus specific thing was one of 5 polarities or duality, you know, things that in tension with each other. So that's one, open versus specific. Another is guidance versus evidence. If you are intending to guide, and that relates to the thing you were just talking about, if you're intending to guide a tester, that's one thing. If you're trying to produce evidence that a test has been performed, that's a different motivation for the documentation. You've got to keep that in mind.
That's a classic mistake people make when they say, oh, we really need test cases. You go, why do you need test cases? Because we have to know what was tested. Wait a minute. I can take test notes. I can take video. I can tell you what I tested. We have log files. We have all kinds of ways to do that without necessarily saying that I'm only going to do this thing at this time.
Plus, they're more evocative.
Yeah.
Plus, they're more evocative. Plus, they focus on what actually happened rather than some abstraction or some wish or desire.
Well, a
or
bunch of
fantasy
green
might
pass,
happen
pass. I mean,
all the
that's
time. Right. And evidence that test cases pass, somebody gives me a list with a bunch of check marks after it. Why should I trust that any more than a story they told supported by videos and mind maps and all kinds of stuff?
exactly.
Why should I trust that?
A lot of the emphasis on these spreadsheets full of these little procedural things with little pass and fails is just based on this weird situation where managers are incredibly skeptical of testers who don't follow pre-scripted actions, but completely trusting of any tester who simply claims to have followed. Why do you not trust me at all when I say I'm not following a script, but you totally trust me when I just say, oh yeah, I did all the scripts. Sure. Yeah, I marked them all as pass. That's,
I don't get it.
I totally trust you. Now I trust you, tester, because you're using a structured method. Really? Okay.
Let's not pull in the structured thread or the whole.
Okay, that's for another time.
Right.
It is
Three more
now
things.
51 minutes into this 10-minute
It'll be an
answer,
hour, and
Michael.
it'd be nice. Might forget versus won't forget. If there's something that's kind of tied into tacit knowledge in a certain sort of way, but if there's something that you're gonna do and you know how to do it, and there's really no reason to believe that you're going to forget to do it, it's going to be packaged into your activity, then don't bother to write it down. A classic example is, because it can be ambiguous too, start the test system or, load the program. Well, I think we can probably trust that if a certain other part of the activity is going to involve the program running, we probably don't need to specify that we load the program. So now the next question is, using that as an example, what other things might we not need to specify? So it's a cost versus value in context dimension. Another thing related to stuff we've been talking about is the procedure that you are encoding, writing down, describing somehow, is it a product that you're going to show off to somebody, to your manager, or is it a tool that's going to keep you organized? If it's a tool that's going to keep you organized, you can crank way down on the formality a lot of the time, because you don't have to worry about gussying it up and presenting it and tidying it and formalizing it. That's expensive, as we alluded to earlier. And the last one I had was setup versus questions, which is my way of saying if it is something that needs to be followed in order to provide you with a kind of integrity of the test, right? We knew that we set this thing up in a certain kind of way. It must be set up in a certain kind of way to perform this experiment, versus how open is the procedure to reinterpretation after that has been done. After you set the thing up properly, now go to town on it. That's an option for the motivation for formalizing a test procedure. You're not actually formalizing the test procedure, you're formalizing a procedure that precedes the actual test. So that's another pair of context factors that you might want to evaluate as you consider what is going to be documented or not.
All right. Well, that's what we have to say for now on the subject of this question, which turned into a whole thing about test cases and narrative test procedures, which are a subset of the world of test cases. Okay. Thank you for attending this edition of Question Hospital. We'll be back someday with question 2. Okay? Question 2
Put
out of
aside some time in
500.
put aside some time in your calendar
Okay.
for this video.
All right. See you later.